clear by listening on channel 5 for English and channel 6 for French. Fabulous. So I'd like to welcome you to this session entitled Harnessing Technology to Accelerate Data-Driven Climate Action in Africa. The premise of this conversation is effectively that, given vast data gaps in the continent, particularly at urban level, particularly around greenhouse gas emissions, let alone resources and consumption such as water, waste, energy, food systems, we clearly need more energy focused on how we build evidence around decision-making and planning for resilient cities. Particularly, we lack disaggregated data by income, gender, age, which limits our ability to track the just transition, to track how different groups in our cities are influenced in different ways, let alone building evidence around the less defined or types of concepts such as resilience or agency. So this means that we have to find many more creative ways to collect data, to aggregate existing data, and to make meaning together. ICLEI Africa has done a lot of work with many stakeholders in cities to collate existing data sets, but more importantly, to bring multiple types of stakeholders together to make meaning of these. And here, often trying processes such as photo voice, welcome in photographic expressions to show, well, what do our cities actually look like? What is really exciting about today's session is that we're going to focus more deeply on the technologies that we are deploying to use data, collate data, and aggregate existing data in cities. Most particularly, hearing from our colleagues at Google about city-level data proxies and models that cities are trying out. So to set the scene in more detail, I'd like to welcome Megan Spires, who's the Director of Climate, Energy and Resilience at ICLEI Africa.
Thank you, Paul. Welcome everyone in the room and also those attending online. It's with great pleasure that ICLEI Africa welcomes you to the session that we are co-convening with Google. I want to echo Paul's request that for you to hear the conversations better, it is good to use headphones, and our colleagues are walking around to make sure all those here in person have headphones. So as Paul said, this session is focused on data. Data has been absolutely essential for planning. There's the age-old adage that if we do not measure, we cannot manage. And so we are particularly excited about this partnership with Google to be able to supply useful, context-specific data to our cities. This has been said in many pavilions and sessions so far at COP27, but it's important to re-emphasize just how important tackling climate change urgently in Africa is. Almost half of our continent's GDP is at risk from climate change by 2023. And this is the continent that has contributed one of the least to climate change, only 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But important to note, emissions have grown by 60% in the last 20 years. So if we continue on this trajectory as Africa and as our African cities, the likelihood of keeping global temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius, which surpassing spells disaster for millions on our continent, becomes less and less likely. We know in our continent that there are data gaps, and this is where these partnerships are so essential. I wanted to highlight two data gaps from both a climate change mitigation perspective and then from a climate change adaptation perspective. WMO recently said that only we only have 1/8 of the minimum density of weather stations required in Africa to be able to model climate change impacts. So we are still grappling with understanding exactly what the impacts will be on a local level in Africa. And then from a mitigation perspective, only 6 out of 54 African countries have reliable and regularly published electricity data at a national level. And that means that it's even more unlikely that we have fine-scale local level data that we can use to measure our carbon emissions and then reduce those emissions. As ICLEI Africa, we have been working over the past 30 years with African cities in developing their climate plans. So far we've developed over 50 with cities from across the continent. And these plans are based on fine-scale data, but they're extremely resource intensive, and not every African city has access to the human and financial resources that are necessary to develop these comprehensive data intensive plans. And this is where partnerships with Google's and others that have access to technology through smartphones, etc., is vital in scaling up good climate plans that lead to action on our continents. Just recently, this year, we launched 4 climate action plans with 4 African cities. And to make the point about just how much resources are required to develop these plans, we engaged with 75,000 data points. We did 4,000 household surveys, 30 plus workshops, engaging with hundreds of national and city stakeholders. And this simply cannot be done with every single African city across the continent. We need to find ways to speed up the process of developing plans, and then much more importantly, speed up the process of implementing those plans tangibly. Some of our experiences have been developing proxy data tools, both from a mitigation and an adaptation perspective. ICLEI most often plays a knowledge broker role between whether it is the data and the scientists and the experts and the city stakeholders, or policy into planning, bridging the gap between these divides, and in particular making clear that decision makers take data and evidence into account when making decisions, but also factor in many other aspects in making those decisions. And our role is to provide as much support and help to our city stakeholders as we possibly can, so that the best decision in that moment based on the current data is made. We are working with Google in particular to look at their Environmental Insights Explorer tool, and that is going to be reflected on by our various panelists as a vital tool on the continent to better analyze data and produce good quality data for our cities. And so that's the correct segue then to invite our colleague from Google, Mr. Adam Ellman, to also make some opening remarks. Welcome, Adam.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Paul. And thank you, ICLEI, for helping to convene this session. As mentioned, my name's Adam Ellman. I'm part of our sustainability team at Google, and I focus on our efforts across Europe, Middle East, and Africa. Sustainability has been a core value for Google ever since the company was founded. And we really think about our work across 3 pillars, starting with leading at Google, our own business, our own operations, our data centers, our buildings. And we've been making good progress. In 2010, we started investing in renewable energy. And by 2017, we were matching 100% of our electricity use on an annual basis with renewables. And we've done so every year since. But we know we need to go further. And we're now focused on achieving net zero in our own operations and our value chain by 2030. And technology underpins everything that we do. But actually, we see the bigger opportunity as helping to innovate technology and helping the world to decarbonise and helping everyone move from ambition to action. And so that's where our second and third pillar really comes in. So our second pillar is how can we enable everyone? And we actually have a goal that we want to enable 1 billion people this year to make more sustainable choices. So for example, if you go onto Google today and look up information about climate change, we'll surface that information in conjunction with the UN to make sure users are getting to see the most trusted and authoritative information. We, on Google Maps, have recently launched a new tool called eco-friendly routing. So if you are driving somewhere, we'll now show you the most fuel-efficient route, how to get there, saving on carbon emissions, saving on fuel, and saving money. And actually that's launching in Egypt in the next few weeks, and will launch to other parts of the region in 2023. And our final pillar, which is very relevant to this discussion today, is supporting partners. Partners for us could be industry, business, cities, governments, NGOs, anyone that we can help together to decarbonise. One of the ways we're doing that is through cities and helping cities, both in terms of climate mitigation, but also adaptation. Now, as you're maybe aware, cities account for around 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And cities generally have big ambitions and want to take action, but they often lack the tools and the data to know what to do or if they're taking the right action. And that's where we want to help. And in 2020, we announced a goal that we want to help 500 cities around the world in aggregate save 1 gigaton of carbon emissions every year by 2030. And to do that, we've developed a tool which was mentioned before called the Environmental Insights Explorer, EIE for short. It's a freely available platform that leverages our geospatial data and provides 40,000 cities with information around to help them measure emissions, identify opportunities to reduce emissions, and to track progress of the interventions that they're taking. And EIE provides a range of data, for example, on building emissions, on transportation emissions, and on rooftop solar potential. And to give you some examples how this is really being used by cities in the real world. So Aurangabad in India has used the tool to actually make changes and invest in cycling and pedestrian infrastructure, and they're putting in 80 kilometers of infrastructure on the back of using EIE. In Izmir, in Turkey, they were really focused on measuring emissions for transportation, but the only way they could do that was looking at fuel cells and car sales. It really wasn't an exact measure, and now they're using EIE to try and get a more accurate and easy to measure information as part of their goal. And in Mexico City, we've worked with officials on the ground and our partner ICLEI to explore the opportunity to deploy 4 megawatts worth of rooftop solar. So some examples of how this is really being used by cities around the world. What I've discussed so far is really focused on mitigation, and we're also now simultaneously looking at where are the opportunities to provide data and tools to help on adaptation as well. So one example is using Google Streetcar views. So if you've used Google Street View before, where we provide photographic imageries of streets, we've now equipped those vehicles with air pollution sensors, and they're able to track at a hyper-local scale air pollution, and we're able to surface that information through EIE, so that local cities, town planners can really see where the impacts are and what changes they need to make. And we've seen that air pollution can differ by 800% just between different roads. Another area we're focused on is on tree canopies, and it's something we're moving out of a pilot phase and rolling out to further cities, where we're able to show cities where the opportunity is to plant trees, to deal with urban heat islands and actually improve quality of life through improving air pollution as well. And that's rolling out to cities as we speak. So today, Environmental Insights Explorer has data for 6,000 cities across Africa, really enabling them to take action. And if you work for a government, if you work for a local city, please do go to insights.sustainability.google to have a look at the tool. As I say, it is free to use. But I do want to flag that data alone is not enough. And it's really important to us that we work with partners and partners on the ground so that we can really understand and make sure that we can validate the data, that we can make sure that it's used in the right context, and to understand what the real needs are. And so again, a big thanks to our partner ICLEI, who are such an important part of helping us drive that. So that's it from me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. It's really important to us. We hear from, as I say, cities on the ground to see how they're using it. Thank you very much, and with that, I'll hand back to Paul. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Megan and Adam for setting the stage for our conversation. I think both have reflected on the powerful tools that are available at hand, as well as the importance of data to drive decision making. But as Adam has closed, hearing on the ground about the challenges and opportunities within cities is really exciting to us in this session. So I'd like to invite an esteemed panel covering cities, data practitioners, and national government to join us on stage and to reflect a bit more deeply about these questions. So if I can invite Councillor Brandon Pretorius, City of Ekurhuleni, Mr. Abdoulaye Sylla, City of Dakar, We can invite Mohammed Hegazi, Managing Director of Transport for Cairo, and Maximus Ugwoke, City Advisor for Lagos, the 40 cities, and Ms. Sandra Mochwanedi, South African Government. Fabulous. So, for our first panel, we're reflecting on how African cities are pursuing data-driven climate action, what challenges and opportunities they're encountering along the way, and what they're learning through this process and overcoming data gaps. So let us start with our representatives of cities. We've got 3 key questions that we've asked them to reflect upon. So the first is, what strategies is your local government using to overcome the challenge of data scarcity in developing ambitious climate plans? How have local knowledge and community participation been valuable in this process? And how are innovative tools and systems such as Google's Environmental Insights Explorer supporting the implementation of data-driven solutions? So I'll hand over first to Councillor.
Thank you and good morning to you all. Ek dink nie dit sou reg gewees het as ek julle nie groet in my moedertaal vanoggend nie. So goeiemôre aan elkeen van julle. But in saying that, I think the important thing to take note is firstly that the city of Ekurhuleni is a metropolitan municipality in Gauteng, which is in South Africa. It also hosts the international airport, one of the largest ones in Africa, the Johannesburg International Airport, and it is one of the most urban areas in South Africa, and we see that the influx of people moving to the city due to the opportunities are growing daily. But I think in response to your question, and it was mentioned by the presenters as well, is that we are seeing these action plans, but we're not necessarily seeing implementation. Apologies. So as the city of Ekurhuleni, we obviously recognize the role that cities should be playing in the emission reduction, and it is therefore that the city has been committing itself to carbon neutral by 2050. Recently the city finalized its Green City Action Plan, and as mentioned, these action plans in actual effect mean nothing if we do not have the correct data to implement these action plans. So for us as a city, we mainly focus on our built environment, energy, water and waste. And it is therefore when we looked at the questions, we utilized the waste environment because that is the data which is most easily accessible to us as a city. So for us, utilizing the Green City Action Plan, it's twofold. It provides data on our current sectoral emissions, and it then also provides 2 scenarios. What would happen if we continue with business as usual, and what would it look like if we actually start implementing these emission reductions. Now, when we looked at the compilation of the action plan itself, and it's important to mention this as it will then get to the question of the data and the scarceness of that data. We obviously looked at our targets, our measures and defined scenarios, and as indicated, the city utilized our waste resource management department as well as external figures which we got from the Google platform itself. But the development of the Green City Action Plan provided the opportunity for ensuring cross-departmental collaboration, as environmental issues is not only an environmental issue, but it's obviously something that needs collaborative working across all departments throughout cities in our instance. So it is therefore that we are saying that as the city, we hope that environments and platforms like the Google Environmental Insight Plans would assist us in not only as the city be able to utilize that data, but then also look at how we can include our citizens to use that data. So for a city, the data scarcity is a reality for us, and if it was not for platforms like that, we would not necessarily be able to implement our action plans. Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing those insights. And I think here, what I take away from this is starting with low-hanging fruit. If there are data available, that's often a great space to start. And then how do we make data available to others and more people to support in making meaning of that? I'd like to invite Mr. Silla, Director of the Planning and Sustainable Development Department at Ville de Dakar.
Merci beaucoup. Je me présente Abdoulaye Silla,
Thank you
directeur.
very much. This is Abdullah Dula, Director of the Planification of the City of Dakar. I must admit that ever since we implemented the strategy relative to the contribution of the national division at the national level, the City of Dakar realized the plan, achieved the plan. So that plan showed us that we had to have data on the vulnerability of Dakar, on its carbonic report as well. But during this exercise, we met different problems, different gaps. When it came to accessing the data, we couldn't access very many data, and the existing data were gross data that could not be modernized, and so we had to work on benchmark with with African cities with which we were sharing the same context in order to extrapolate to give the city carbon report. But ever since 2018, we have an annual template on the evolution of this data. So thanks to Google, we were able to explore the, thanks to Google Environmental Exploration for Dakar in order to complete this data. And with this plan, the city of Dakar committed to measure the captors and the module capture that would enable to get some data on the field, and this data would be complemented by the Google data that will enable the authorities to make decisions concerning the evolution of the climate and to take climatic actions for Dakar.
Thank you so much. The two nuggets there for me are benchmarking with a template that allows you to track your change over time to actually see progress, which is great. And then the point of using these broad data sets online as well as local data collection to validate and confirm. So now turning over to some of our colleagues in helping to make meaning of data and collecting data, I'd like to invite two colleagues to reflect on the following two questions. What is the most critical challenge or gap relating to data for local climate action that you experience from your work with local governments? And then, how do you see technology, participatory planning, and other innovative tools and solutions in supporting climate action? So let's start with Mohammed Hagazi, Managing Director of Transport for Cairo.
Thank you. So, if we're gonna start with challenges, I think the main challenge is that data ought to represent reality. And often the data that we get, especially secondary data, just doesn't. When we talk about transport, in Africa in particular, but in half of the world uses informal transport. We've got them in South Africa in the minibus taxi industry. We've got them in the Ville de Dakar. Before they were aggregated in like economic entities. And we've got them in Egypt. In Cairo, they're 2/3 of transport. And this is the raison d'etre of my company. When we started, it was to create a map, to create deep data sets of these informal transport systems, networks, on the route level, on the to get this overview of the system level. And everybody says that data is a problem and getting data is a problem. Actually, data is never the problem. The problem is the funding, and it's the people who know what to do with the money when they get it in the first place. And this is a serious issue because once we got the first funding to create the data, our hypothesis was that we will be able to license it out to global data aggregators such as Google to keep it updated and create a continuous loop. Well, we did license it. The data for the informal transport in Cairo is on Google Maps, but it was a one-off license. So suddenly the issue of keeping it up to date, which is much lower cost, is not happening, breaking the business model. And staffing is obviously an issue, it's capacity, but to build capacity and maintain it over time, you need money. This is something that we managed to do in our company, but we are a private sector, but the government is not doing because they don't have a complete picture of the data value chain. Which takes me to the technical side, and I'm moving to the second part of the question about the opportunities of technology. I strongly believe in the interaction between human and machine. When we do our data collection, we generally get the data using humans. We go on the field, we have like 50 people, 4 months, taking every route we can find multiple times, but with really powerful statistics. They're guided by algorithms that send them to which routes they map. It's never through lists. And we merge this data with a lot of data we get through Google, actually, through APIs, but also from other data providers and secondary and tertiary data. And this matters because we start filling the gaps of the other. To give you a very specific example, I looked at the methodology of the EIE, and it's an amazing platform. I can't wait until it launches in Cairo. But one of the first steps in the methodology is, what's the boundary of the city? We use data from the Atlas of Urban Expansion. It's been validated by UN Habitat. I think Iqlai also worked on its production to use the boundary of Cairo. And we did a study for the World Bank on it. And 4 months into the study, we're like, wait, where is Hadaya al-Ahram? That's a neighborhood in Cairo, and it has 1 million people. It was the missing million. And they weren't picked up by the algorithm. And again, human machine. This is where the local knowledge, the human, to validate the globally aggregated data set really unlocks new levels of values. So our company, what we do is that we have multiple products. There is an analytical product, which really refers to our human capacity, but it's based on 2 technology products. And one is our own. It is Root Lab, which allows us to really facilitate this human-based data collection on the field because it's expensive. And as was mentioned, household surveys by Maren earlier are expensive to do, but they're a necessity. And the other is the data portal, in which we aggregate these data sets with every big data mass data set that we can get our hands on. I end here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think here, for me, that question of the boundary of the city is fascinating. You know, people do not respect administrative boundaries. They'll walk across them. So how do we understand the boundary of a city when trying to make clear decisions about which data to use, as well as what those consequences of those data are for decisions around taxation, around planning, around infrastructure development. And then, of course, a fabulous point on informal systems, which are not necessarily matched in the plans that we make. So now to hand over to Maximus for some reflections from Lagos.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. From our perspective and the work we do with the cities across Africa region, especially in Lagos, cities do have data. Whether they are looking for data on elements of weather to carry out a climate risk assessment, or want to do an emissions inventory, in which case we're looking for data on energy, transport, and waste, we have data. But the major challenge is that those data are scattered in various ministries, departments, and agencies. And more often than not, the harbingers of those data don't even have a need for it, especially when it comes to climate planning and climate action. So it's a major challenge. So if you look at all across the value chain, collection, storage, processing and retrieval is a major challenge. And I think This is one of the areas Google can help cities to really leverage on technology to see how they can develop knowledge product to store some of this data at the local level. At the local level, the technology should be tailor-made such that it, answers to the need of the peculiarities of various cities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that's an experience across so many cities and so many organizations, is that there are data, but they're not necessarily brought together. And I think we'll touch on that. Certainly, I see some nods from other panelists. Now, our last input from a national government level to reflect on where you see the synergies between local and national strategies to address data gaps, and how you think local and national government can work together on climate action planning. Hearing from Ms. Sandra Mashwanedi.
Thank you so much. As already told you, my name is Sandra Mshwanedi. Sorry, can I remove? Yeah. So my name is Sandra Mshwanedi. I work for the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment at South Africa. It's great to really just hear the inputs from the colleagues from the city and also my colleague from the city of Ekurhuleni. So in terms of national government, first of all, as national government of South Africa, we are directed by the National Climate Change Response Policy, which really has two objectives, really to ensure that South Africa does its fair share in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, as well as transitioning to a climate resilient society. So as South Africa, we normally track our progress towards transitioning to the lower climate economy through the National Climate Change Response Database. And previously, we would request both provinces and municipalities to really report on the programs and the projects as well as their policies through our National Climate Change Response Database. But we realized that this was creating a reporting fatigue for municipalities and provinces. So in order to harmonize and synergize our data collection, we tried to link up our National Climate Change Response Database with the municipalities. So now we've helped municipalities come up with, some of the municipalities in South Africa come up with their own municipal climate change response databases. So when they report on the progress of their policies and measures, as well as their programs and projects, that information that they report in their database automatically goes into the National Climate Change Response Database. So then as national government, we are able to receive this data, validate this data, and really check that is in the correct format that we would like it to be in. And then we'll be able to then analyze this data for GHG impacts and as well as non-GHG impacts. And then in analyzing this data, it is then that we are able to effectively monitor if we are on track in terms of meeting our objectives in the National Climate Change Response Policy. In addition, in terms of helping municipalities, we have also developed what we call a National Climate Change Response Toolkit, which really also helps municipalities to integrate climate change in their integrated development plans. And in this way, we are ensuring that municipalities take into consideration climate change when they develop their annual plans. So these are some of the ways that we as national governments, we are really trying to harmonize data and make sure that there's no reporting fatigue in local municipalities, and also to make sure that we have the data that we need from them that can really help us to analyze if we are on track in terms of transitioning to the lower carbon economy, as well as climate resilient society. And also, in addition, that data also helps us to report internationally, because as you know, we are, as a party to both the convention and the Paris Agreement, we are also required to report on what we're doing to respond to climate change. So not only do we also use that progress to just measure ourselves where we are, but we also use that that data to really report to the international community and really also to inform future policy making, because it is through monitoring and evaluation that you can see that you are on track, and then you can be able to take the relevant decision on what future climate action to take. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think there, the support that national can provide to local level in terms of having a platform that can aggregate data systems, but then also the support that local government is offering at national level to help national reporting to be a bit more accurate. I saw Mohammed eager to add to the question on data scattering across departments. So maybe I'll invite him to offer a reflection on that. And then if I can invite Councillor Pretorius to speak a bit more about some of the cross-departmental interaction for data collection. And then you mentioned citizen engagement as well. What does that look like in data?
Well, thank you. Well, it's because these stories that were mentioned by Mr. Maximus and the lady from South Africa resonate so much. So I want to tell you a story from a city we worked in, specifically Accra in Ghana. So you have 26 municipalities and within the city, and they manage each their taxi parks and their licenses of the minibus taxis that operate from them. And they had a system that used to manage this data, and then this national government didn't pay the bill, so it was caught out, so they created their own ad hoc system. 12 years later we arrive and we find that they're still using it, and it's an Excel file of the original system that they exported 12 years ago and have continued on using ever since. And to me this was absolutely shocking, but also very telling, because if the need is there, people will use the system. Reporting fatigue can be avoided by the automated collection, which is very easy using digital technologies, and they will use it if it does their work. And their work has nothing to do with network planning or climate change. It has everything to do with giving licenses to the drivers that are knocking on their doors day in, day out. And this is why I'm inviting you to look at the value chain slightly different, in addition to the technical one mentioned by Mr. Maximus of collection, storage and retrieval, but also to the institutional value chain. If my job is to regulate, if we can provide the institution a free-to-use system where they can manage their daily data flows, everybody used how to use Google Maps to drive on Uber. People will use the technology, but it aggregates the data and makes it available to the central local government and then back to the national government. This is the key action point, and I think this is what brings us to COP, because the financing of this system is often not there. Remember Accra, they bought a system in 2010, stopped using it in 2011, export, and they kept on using the exported Excel files as their disaggregated system for 12 years before we arrived and learned this and started helping them build a system that they can use on a longer term. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If you listen to what the panel is saying, you would think that we caucused before the engagement because we are echoing what everyone else is saying. I think there's 4 important points in response, and to look at what innovative tools came out of our engagement as a city towards this. You need to take into consideration that we've got action plans, but as indicated, not necessarily aggressive implementation. So as the city, as we were developing our Green City Action Plan, the Cities Climate Division then created a central depository for information and data pertaining to climate change, to speak exactly to what was mentioned, to bring all the information together to ensure that it facilitates the coordination within the municipality, then to look at the implementation. I think for us as a city, the current gap that exists is real-time monitoring of our actual effects. And this comes back to the earlier point which I mentioned, to say that citizens need to be able to track what their cities are doing. and how they can also get involved in obviously aggressively assisting with the implementing. But I think accessibility on data emissions and the trends is one of the important factors for us, and it's also playing a vital role in achieving our short and long-term goals. Thank you.
I think you've touched on a really valuable point. If there are people living in the city who wish to live a sustainable lifestyle, how will they know? And I think what was quite resonant about, for example, living through Cape Town's water crisis was having to translate, well, what does 50 litres consumption per day mean? I don't know how much water I'm using on a daily basis. So a lot of information tools were developed to demystify that and say, okay, it's 1 toilet flush a day, it's a 2 to 3 minute shower, it's 1 litre for my pets, and to try and break that down into something that's more accessible. So I think that's a really important point of inviting citizens in to understand how they're contributing to the broader system. I'd like to invite our colleague from Dakar to reflect on the citizen role in planning as well.
Merci. Il y a un état de fait.
Thank you. There is a state in Africa, and specifically in Senegal. The gas emission is not very well put in priority, to the extent where we say that Africa does not participate a lot in gas emission at the world scale. So we should mostly be presented to the adaptation elements, but more in the field of inclusivity. We did an exercise, what we call
Lorsqu'on s'est approché des populations, leur priorité, c'est la pollution de l'air. Ce ne sont pas les inondations, ni les
or coastal region, but pollution. They start to feel more and more this condition because of how all the transportation systems are, because of the presence of industry, polluting industry. Population feel that they are not breathing fresh air. So to show you that today, if we do an inclusive study, we can see that what the government put in priority is at the opposite to what the population see as a priority. Thank you.
Can I ask a follow-up to that briefly? Given the conversation today around technology and data collection, how are you trying to fill those data gaps and work to get the data around adaptation?
Merci. Bon, aujourd'hui au Sénégal,
in Senegal, we are working on the platform of treatment of data. So we have people who work on ecological adaptation. We have studies on the authority on the transport regulation when we are dealing with data for transport. And today we are working on unifying this data within the city of Dakar and also on the national level.
Maximus, please, you wanted to add a reflection from Lagos?
Yeah. Okay. So I think how to bridge this gap. It is important for us to have a central data storage facilities at the city level, because, like I said earlier, our data are scattered in various places. Unfortunately, most city officials work in silos. So if there will be a technology that could help us to warehouse this information such that various ministries, departments, and agencies should be able to feed in their data, and there should be a central body that will be coordinating those data, is going to help us a great deal. And this, for me, is just a practical solution to the data challenges we are having in cities. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So you're proposing we need a bit of a special purpose vehicle that does that aggregation.
Exactly. So it acts like if like a one-stop shop for data in cities. We're looking for data in energy, in transport, and in waste. Such tailor-made data storage facility should be introduced, and there should be a central management body so that access to those data will be easier, instead of having to relate with all the MDAs, and in our own context is extremely bureaucratic, and sometimes you end up not getting the data that has integrity. So it's important to have a kind of a one-stop shop that will manage all those data. Thank you. And I'm sure Google can do that.
So Google's got a call, more data in an aggregated way for direct use. I'd like to ask Sandra just to reflect a little bit on something you shared and a provocation that Mohammed made. You're offering a toolkit on climate planning for use at local level. How we know that climate, of course, has to be undertaken by multiple departments across the city. How does this toolkit, tripping of my language, how does this toolkit help those in different departments to come together in cities?
Thank you very much. That's a very important question. So in using this toolkit, there's a certain level of information that cities must provide that will help them really integrate climate change. So as they do planning for the different sections, then in using the toolkit, then the city can be able to say, okay, does this type of action or this type of planning that I'm doing have any impact on climate change? And if it does, what kind of an impact it is? So in that way, it also
Mohammed, you wanted to raise your hand to add something? Otherwise, we can take some questions as well from some of our participants. I hope there are some ideas musing.
I just wanted to talk about adaptation very quickly and briefly, because this is an area where the use of big data can actually be very, very helpful. If you look at Cairo, for instance, we actually have a flooding problem during the winter months when it rains, and it is hyper-localized. That is that particular streets, particular areas in the low elevations are the one where the water aggregates, and then suddenly traffic stops. And this is, for instance, something that can be calculated en masse using an algorithm to help cities in their adaptation planning. Another issue, for instance, would be heat. And I saw that the EIE also has a tree canopy feature that was mentioned earlier in the introduction. And this is really important because we completely underestimate the need for residents to adapt to heat. I was once talking to a taxi driver and he was telling me, I need to take a break every other hour in the shade, also because otherwise my car will overheat. So having this data incorporated into a platform such as Google Maps is an opportunity.
Thanks so much. I'd like to invite if there are any burning questions around your own experiences of trying to access data. Gabriela.
Hello. Thank you very much. Good morning. I am Alice Daniela Torres, working for ICLE Europe for several years, also working in the Google EIE project for European cities. And what we have seen in the experience of the cities using the tool is that there is a need also of working together with the climate teams and the IT or smart city data experts of the city to understand and better interpret the data. So is this a challenge also in African cities? How do you work between departments to make the most use of this data and other data sources?
Who would like to take that question? Councillor?
Yes, thank you so much. Apologies, my headset gone down, so I caught the last part of your question. But as indicated through the planning of our Green City Action Plan, in the city of Ekurhuleni, we actually have a centralized point. So even though our departments to a certain extent work in silos, we've got a dedicated team that looks into this data and then disseminates that data from the central point. So as indicated, the data in its current format is still a bit limited. However, we do have that function in place in the city of Ekurhuleni specifically to then send through this data to the departments to see how we then adjust our strategies also, importantly so, to see how we adjust our strategies to the actual effect of the residents on the ground.
Vildaka?
Let me just add that working with Lagos has enabled us to unlock those data sources. Now, the challenge is how to have a tool that can help us to store those data on a sustainable basis. That is where we are now. That's why I believe very strongly that if Google can develop a tool that will help us to store those data and then to retrieve it, that's going to be very helpful. Thank you.
Oui, juste pour compléter, il y a d'abord la méthode d'accès aux données. Aujourd'hui, nous avons utilisé à la ville de Dakar la méthodologie donc, de la Convention des maires afin d'avoir des données. Et ce fut notre premier inventaire. Le premier inventaire du bilan des gaz à effet de serre a été réalisé à Dakar. Le fut en 2019. Donc, la ville de Dakar se positionne comme entité de centralisation aujourd'hui des données au niveau donc, de la municipalité, même s'il y a beaucoup d'autres structures qui travaillent sur des données climatiques. Merci.
Mohammed?
I think it's very important to remember one thing. We're talking about Africa, so most cities, especially secondary and tertiary cities, do not have capacity. And this means that most of the planning projects actually end up happening by consultants who come on a per project level, and they often change from one project to the other and need to build on top of each other. And this issue requires a rethinking of how things work. Like, I fully agree with you that there is a need for a centralized office, especially because there is some specialized knowledge that's also needed, be it on the data management side, on the subject matter side. Are we talking about heat? Are we talking about water? Are we talking about energy or transport? Or be it also in the political side, which entities are responsible for what? And given that, there's been some efforts, initiatives to aggregate data across projects. Digital Transport for Africa is one that tries to have all the transport projects aggregate their data in one area to make it easy to start up and running quickly. And another point is, in every project we do, we seek out to the technology companies, Google, Uber, to try to get some of the data. Sometimes also the data of the Cairo Metro we did, for instance. But this reach out process, half of the times it doesn't lead a result. And the other half, it leads it too late because of the need for non-compete, like an NDA and the legal paperwork. So the platform is beautiful because it allows an easy-to-use interface that can be used by end users. But when you get specialized consultants coming in on a per-project basis for a limited time, they want to jump in quickly, we need more powerful and more robust frameworks. So could it be that there is a second tier for professional companies that they can build a longer term relationship with the tech companies, that they can get deeper level, granular access also on statistics, sampling sizes? Is this data for this city actionable or not? That they can then integrate it in the methodologies and workflows much earlier and faster and pre-project. This is something that can unlock international local benefits.
Thanks so much. That point has really been voiced by a number of local government officers to say we're aware that there are so many projects and research studies going on of the city, but these are not within reach and might have been done 3 or 4 years ago with a different officer, which are then sent into their mail system and not actually into a centralized database that can then be used later. So there's a lot of ad hoc studies going on that are just not correlated effectively. And a number of cities have started developing research offices that say, we want to do research here. We're so excited. We'll help you do it. But the conditions are you give us the data sets or the outcomes so that we can use them further.
Voilà, merci beaucoup. Je vous remercie vraiment pour cette
Thank you
opportunité.
very much. I'm really grateful for the opportunities to have this meeting today, and especially about communication. I think that everything you do is important. It's very important. There is a problem, and the problem is communication. Even we're French-speaking people, and I know that a lot of time we don't get an answer, and I think it is because it's a language issue. We have to do everything we can in order to use the right language. The French language is not used in everything you use. I am not blaming you. It's just that a lot of time we cannot understand something, and we have to use Google Translate, and it's not very accurate. It gives us more work. Donc, I would appreciate if you make more effort, if in order to implicate to allow us to participate easier in our language.
Okay, thank you very much. I agree. We're doing our best to welcome different languages, but you're right. There is a big divide between Francophone and Anglophone and Lusophone Africa, and it requires bridging.
Hello. My name is Karima. I'm from Resilient Cities Catalyst, a nonprofit based in New York. And I'm very much enjoying the panel on data. I love this idea of maybe having a chief data officer or a special purpose vehicle, in order to centralize this data idea. And I'm sorry, I'm a little bit late, so maybe this conversation has already happened, but I would really love to know, one thing about adoption of data is it's really hard with any city, whether you have capacity or no capacity, in order to adopt data, and really because there aren't technical skills within cities and you really don't have that capacity. So can you explain maybe or give an example of cases where you've really been able to train city staff in order to adapt data and some of the data programs within cities, and what has that looked like on the ground, and how have you been able to kind of build that success?
Okay, thank you very much. This is a very fantastic question, and it speaks to the reality on the ground. The truth of the matter is that we have serious capacity problems. But through the support we give to cities, especially through the climate action and planning process, we brought to the realization of, first of all, is the type of data we need. We need data on energy, transport, waste, and of course, we want to extend it to agriculture and industrial process and product use. We have data gaps all across. But the fact of the matter is that we are taking it a step at a time. First of all, is to realize that there is need to have data across all those sectors. That is number one. Number two is that we now have a team. If you come to Lagos now, we have a team that is dedicated to data on climate change issues. So if you want to give support with regards to training, at least those we are supposed to train. So that is our, experience working with Lagos. We have a team that is dedicated to data gathering, and the next step now is to see how we can train them. Thank you.
Yeah, to Councillor Pretorius.
Yes, thank you. I think just maybe as a second part to your question, for us as a city, the only data that we are able to internally look at is our waste management data, because obviously we've got landfill sites, and in our instance it's 9. So those are the only department that we have managed to actually train people, look at that data, see what it's like. We've sourced funding to get the correct data capturing measures. But as indicated by Maximus, a lot of these things obviously require resources. And unfortunately, it's something that we should probably not be mentioning anymore, but COVID still has an effect on us as cities. It still has an effect on us and on our finances. So that is why we are heavily reliant on entities like Google, for instance, in this instance. And it's not that Maximus is pushing them, but we know that they've got the funds, you know, and we need the data to ensure that we can action climate change. But for us, it's basically waste management is our focus point.
Thanks very much for the reflections. At this stage, we were going to be inviting the governor of Nairobi to reflect on some of their work in Nairobi, but he hasn't yet arrived. So I'm going to, in a way, drop you in a bit of a deeper end with an extra question we were going to have in that conversation. And that is a reflection that, especially with many different entities coming forward and making their mission about, let's get the data, let's get the evidence, let's get the data, let's get the evidence, and not necessarily engaging with how decisions are made in local government, and not necessarily looking at the relationship between technical and political decision-making. So the conversation is really going to be about the culture of decision-making at local level and how we influence that to make use of evidence. So I'd like to ask you to reflect, based on the work that you're doing, what is the culture of decision-making in your city? How is evidence used or not? What are the gaps and opportunities in building that culture?
I think for us, and luckily for me, I see that my counterpart from National is just about to leave, so I can speak freely. But in saying that, I think we've mentioned it quite a few times, and it comes back to not necessarily decision-making, but implementation. And for us as a city, it's very important that we do not bring the implementation of climate change in a dictative form to our citizens. We want people to participate actively. And that is why we're saying when one looks at this data, the data needs to be downtoned to a sense where it's understandable for everyone and accessible to everyone, so that they can partake in this data. And again, especially looking at our resources. But ultimately for us as a city, we obviously form part of our national government's guidelines and policies to look at how we then go on further in implementing climate change. However, in the dynamics in South Africa, politics to a certain extent has changed, and municipalities is now overstepping their boundaries in a positive way in saying that we are a local municipality, but whether it is our responsibility or not, we are taking charge of this matter. And again, that is why these forums are so important for us, and also to make these connections with different counterparts and stakeholders, because at times the filtering down of information is what prohibits us from continuing with climate change actions.
Well, I don't know why I'm in storytelling mode today, but I think that I fully agree on this mismatch between often what the data is needed for and a centralized point, especially when we talk about a global challenge like climate change that needs systems change, and between the local needs and the local like actions and politics. And when we talked about capacity building earlier, we've done like 50 projects. All of them have a capacity building component. And honestly, most of them miss the mark because we don't really hit the local need. And I want to mention a story because it's also a story of data a little bit. We did an analytical product for a city in Cairo showing that the network is very inefficient. It wasn't acted upon. We worked in another city in an outskirts of a tertiary city, and we saw how the stage manager of the minibus service changed the route of the minibuses on the day of the exams of his daughter so that it takes a direct route rather than two interchanges so that they get on time. He got arrested and then let off when people realized that he did it for a good reason. And this is a data problem because he got arrested for breaking the rule, which would have been embedded in the data, which created a disincentive for him to change to a digital data system. So again, this is where the mix between the aggregate central need, especially when I talk about a central unit or an SPV, and between the hyper-local actions and also decision-making, it's a really balancing, and it's really requires these relationships with the local entities to function effectively. So maybe this is a little bit an invitation to be humble about the design choices that we make, especially on institutional level, when we redesign our cities.
Absolutely. You have said it all.
You say you said it all. There's no more to say. I wonder, is this the case as well in Ville Dakar? What is the culture of decision making around sustainability or development? And again, what is the culture around decision making for sustainability or development? And how do we influence that to make use of the right types of evidence?
Vaincre un peu, parce que nous, ce qu'on mettait en place, ce qu'on réalisait, le plan climat, c'était sous la direction d'une équipe municipale.
But the current team, we were able to put it at the right level and to access of the
On a organisé un forum sur l'eau à Dakar, Dakar dans les eaux. Pour montrer, même si dans nos compétences en tant que collectivité locale, l'assainissement n'en fait pas partie, mais on a mené une réflexion sur une problématique qui est l'accès à l'eau potable déjà, parce que Dakar puise son eau à presque 300 km de Dakar. C'est une vulnérabilité. Aujourd'hui, avec la modification du bâti et l'augmentation des usages, ça augmente, ça explose. Dakar, c'est 150 000 habitants tous les 5 ans, etc. Donc, on a montré avec l'urbanisation, l'hydrologie urbaine, les bassins versants ont changé de morphologie. Donc, l'ensemble de ces éléments nous ont amenés à expliquer comment vraiment prendre en charge l'urgence de l'action climatique. Et c'est en cela que nous travaillons. Merci.
Merci bien, thank you. So I think it's time maybe just for a closing reflection, and perhaps I'll frame this as a bit of an ask. And you voiced a few needs in your interventions about what you would like to see about a centralized data system or the data system in your cities. So maybe here, what would you like to see over the next years from Google's Enviro Insights Explorer tool?
Bon, je vais rebondir. Donc, nous adoptons déjà Google Environmental.
So we're adopting Google Insight Explorer to complete the data that we already have. So we're going to keep measuring on the field, but with Google data. So that will enable us to complete our data and to centralize it within the same service, because right now the challenge in Dakar is an information system that would enable to centralize all of the data. And so it would be a source of motivation and continuity maintenance of these actions.
As a matter of fact, I'm just hearing about the environment impact is inside Explorer for the first time. And this speaks to the need for Google to scale up its public awareness campaign on some of the products it has developed, especially when it has to do with the environment. That is number one. Number two is that Google should, in developing knowledge products that has to do with the local people, they should try and get them involved from the get-go. They should seek local knowledge or local expertise to support the work they do. That is going to help a great deal. You know, for me, these two things are the major takeaways from Google. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I have to agree with what Maximus is saying. As an example, in Ekurhuleni, at one of our landfill sites, we've got an informal settlement called Plastic City. Plastic City is an informal settlement which basically scavenges waste from the landfill site, carries it across to the informal settlement, and then recycles the scavenged waste. The problem, however, what we are having as a city is that obviously they're not bringing across only what they need for recycling purposes. They bring across everything. So you've got a twofold. On the one end, they're doing us a huge favor by recycling the plastic. But on the other end, to get, for instance, wiring out of used vehicle tires, there's a lot of burning of that. So it's twofold, you know. So the benefit is actually being eliminated by the negative of the effect. And things like that need to be regularized. And that's why it comes down to what we've been saying, and Maximus has echoed it as well. Community participation is of utmost importance because to come through and dictate it through to the community is one thing, but to get them to participate is another. And unfortunately, not in all cities, law enforcement is as what you would find in another. So that is quite important. And then obviously for the data to be specific, we spoke about it and we've made mention. There's no point in having the data from Lagos in Ekurhuleni because it doesn't speak to one another. We need focused data. And in our instance, it would be fossil fuel and waste management, you know. So I think that is what is of utmost importance to us. But we would most definitely want to see more accessible data, as I indicated earlier, being understandable to the local communities and also for them to be able to provide data.
A reflection on some of the themes from the discussion?
Yes, so in response to your question about what we would hope to see from the platform, from Google as a company as well, I would say two things. Consultant engagement platform as part of EIE, and the second would be structure for longer-term capacity building partnerships. Let me elaborate on both. What I mean by a consultant engagement platform is bilateral relationship between consulting companies that can apply and Google and the EIE platform that gets deeper than what is currently publicly available. And it's bilateral, it goes both ways. If we talk about a city like Cairo or cities in Egypt in general, we definitely have the local capacity to provide more accurate, more thought through, more informed boundary data, more informed population data, link it with data sets that exist in government. Like, remember, we have statistics offices. And yes, global databases do that, but at a much, much weaker granularity. So that is something that the local partners can provide. What the consultants need to be able to use that data in the planning, in the strategies, the stuff that ends up shaping local, but also regional and national policy in strategy in the end, the level of engagement needs to deepen. We're talking about technical stuff, sampling sizes, specifics of the methodologies, sometimes access to raw data or particular raw data sets, because without these, sometimes you don't have the legitimacy to use it in a scientific product, an analytical product that you're producing and selling. So this is my interpretation of what a consultant engagement platform would look like. The second thing is long-term capacity building partnerships. The data collection that we do on the transport networks, it is human-based. It costs money because it gets exactly the kind of data gap that big data sources, automated sensor methodologies, remote sensing cannot provide. But this costs money. And it's money that the local entities do not have the market power to monetize and thus to keep up to date, which is exactly what global platforms like Google have. So creating a contractual structure, but also a structure that benefits local cities is the only way to create this data and maintain it in the long term. Because the business model of cities like London or Pittsburgh, where GTFS, the standard for public transport information, originated, simply doesn't work. Their data is an exhaust. It comes out and can be used or not used as a system that already exists. But if we want to create this data specifically for use in our cities, it costs money, and it's not monetizable. You cannot, the creators of the data cannot capture the value that is generated by it. I stop here.
Thank you so much. From ICLEI Africa's perspective, I'd like to offer a warm welcome, a warm thank you to our panelists. And can I ask everyone to offer a round of applause? And you're welcome to take seats again for the closing. So based on the discussion that's taken place on stage, I'd like to welcome Princilia Boagwehe from Google, the head of Pan-African institutions, to offer a reflection on what she's heard and how Google is going to take some of this work forward.
Thank you so much. Good morning. That was an excellent panel session. I feel like I've been given the very difficult task of coming after all these very specific but useful challenges to Google. And we accept the challenge. So thank you. My name is Princilia Boagwehe. I am our lead for Pan-African institutions. And what that means is my mission is to figure out how we at Google Africa can expand our impact at scale across the continent. And I do this primarily through the African Union, but also with UN organizations and with partners across the continent. So this is my first COP. This is my first time attending. I've been really just listening and learning and trying to figure out how we can take back this feedback, right? And then implement it and take more action so that we can be more helpful, which is Google's mission. So 2 days ago, we held an event with the African Union Commission. We had some participants here who attended with us. The African Union launched its climate action and development strategy for the entire continent. And it was really inspiring for me. I'm originally from Côte d'Ivoire, from Ivory Coast, just to see our leaders at the Pan-African level really trying to take steps to address the climate crisis. And then our leaders at the national level and also at the city level, right? We have to do this at every step of our society. So it's been really, really helpful to kind of see this in action. So like I said, I took some notes. I heard the call for more data, more specific data, better communication. And I'm really going to engage with our different teams to figure out how we can do better. But I'd like to share with you a little bit about what we're currently doing on the continent. What do we have going on? And what is our focus on sustainability? So our journey in the region is about 15 years old. Last year, we pledged to invest $1 billion in Africa over a 5-year period. And the purpose of our investment is to accelerate the continent's digital transformation. And the more I hear these sessions, the more I'm engaging with researchers, data scientists, politicians. I'm just seeing how crucial this digital transformation really is, right? Not only for our products like the Environmental Insights Explorer you were all discussing today, but this data that provides the information that people need to make more informed decision at an individual level. And then also in order to make the information more accessible. So I did hear that, right? How do we then include local populations into the discussion? Because some of this is highly technical, highly specific, and it's not really digestible, right? So we did bring 4 YouTube creators that are here with us as Google during COP. They have an audience of about 20 million people. They're young people from all over the world, including from Africa. I would love to extend their reach to you all, to the panelists here as well, to engage with them. And their job is really just to see how do we take this information and share it with a global audience so that people are more included and they have more ownership over this conversation. And then lastly, supporting partnerships. We want to partner with governments to support the policy implementation. From a policy angle, we focus on supporting policies that encourage infrastructure, develop talent, sound regulatory environments, and that promote innovation. On innovation, we at Google believe that technologies such as artificial intelligence and machine learning have a key role to play in addressing the climate crisis. Many of the solutions that Google is working on are being developed by our research teams in Accra in Ghana. So we have an AI research center that is actually physically located there with Ghanaian researchers, PhD students, and scientists. And they are developing extremely amazing technology. I'll give you 3 examples. One of them is a flood forecasting mechanism. We just announced it last week. And it's going to provide alerts on flood forecasting to river basins in 15 countries across the continent, from Burkina Faso to Guinea, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, South Africa, just many countries. And then secondly, they're working on the issue of pest infestation on locust prevention and locust detection, right? Because pest infestations threaten entire crops and impact the livelihoods of millions. So we're working in collaboration with the Food and Agriculture Organization to develop this technology and detect locust outbreaks so that it's possible to implement control measures. And then lastly, satellite imagery. The AI research team has used machine learning to detect more than 500 million structures across Africa. A few years ago, you couldn't even find many of the buildings on Google Maps, and now you can find them. And that is thanks specifically to the AI research team in Ghana through the satellite imagery that they have developed. And so this information is also being used by UN organizations and governments for the distribution of humanitarian responses and aid. And that's from our African talents here. So I think the key takeaway for me is that we must all continue to learn and to improve and come from a place of humility. That's where I'm coming from. And we can only do this together through your feedback and through a collaborative relationship. So that's really why I'm here, is to connect with people, engage, and see what we can do together. So I appreciate your time. Thank you for inviting us. Thank you for facilitating this discussion. And we look forward to seeing what we can do together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Priscilla. From ICLEI Africa's side, we just want to say a big thank you to all of our panelists. The conversations were really rich. And we really want to say thank you to Google, not just for coming to the COP with your technology and the information that you want to share, but also the way with which you're doing that Priscilla made clear, is with humility, is with wanting to serve, and that's exactly the same culture and principles that ICLEI Africa adheres to. We're here to serve our cities. So with that, we will close the session. There will be a short video that will now play, but please remain behind, chat to the Google colleagues, come and chat to us as ICLEI Africa staff or our ICLEI Europe or ICLEI World Secretariat staff. We really want to keep the conversation going. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you have checked out the other sessions as part of the Urban Africa in Action at COP. If not, you can find our schedule at the reception area. You can take a photo of the QR code, and we look forward to seeing you in future sessions. Most notably, in my mind, tomorrow's session on urban food systems and adaptation will be at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Have a splendid day further and look forward to the conversations.